네, 안녕하세요.
Good afternoon. Now it is time to get started with the session number 2. In the morning, we had heated debate, and the talk was really wonderful. And regarding the Earth Jurisprudence, we heard a lot of the insights. In the afternoon, we're gonna listen to more how we can handle this climate crisis, what kind of governance system should be developed. And we have renowned scholar, and 2 scholars will make a presentation, and then we're gonna have a discussion. The first presenter is Dr. Louis Kutze, and for the Research Institute of the Hamburg, he is a research fellow, and it's more like a think tank. And yesterday, he and I had some conversation, and that is the organization studying the sustainability from the multidisciplinary approach. And he is a research fellow at the Hamburg institution. He is originally from South Africa, and he is the professor for the Northwest University, and also he's working for the Lincoln University of the UK. And for the ecological constitution, and in the morning, yes, we had some discussion about the ecological constitution, and also regarding the Earth governance, he has lots of studies about the ecological constitution and the Earth governance. Now the floor is yours. Please welcome him with big hands.
Thank you very much for this very warm welcome. So, dear dignitaries, colleagues, guests, I'm really deeply honored to be here today with you, and my deep appreciation certainly, especially to Minister Kang and her colleagues for the very warm invitation and the extremely generous hosting that we enjoy here. I am absolutely delighted to be with you and to join in this important discussion about Earth jurisprudence and the planetary vision of environmental protection that we are having over the course of these 2 days. I firmly believe that despite all of these crises that we facing from war, hunger, oppression, and so forth, the planetary crisis certainly is now the most urgent one to consider. And as Minister Kang had so eloquently said also in her keynote this morning, humans have become a very, very powerful geological planetary agents. And we have entered the Anthropocene, which is characterized possibly by irreversible impacts on planetary integrity, increasing zoonotic diseases, as we see with COVID, for example, intensified differentially distributed vulnerabilities that characterize a deeply uneven world order, and of course, the rise of geopolitical conflicts, as we see. And this is the crisis of the Anthropocene. Alarming climatic, ecological, and certainly also public health trends, which are all unfolding with very little evidence of abating. And the convergence of all of these trends could lead to a comprehensive crisis where multiple risks materialize in reinforcing ways. Now, Joshua Gellers argues that the pronouncement of a new geological epoch has created the discursive space that we urgently need to critically re-examine the role of law and governance, and imagining in a creative way, an innovative way, a daring way perhaps, how it might be reconceived to address the complex problems caused by industrialization on the scale of the entire Earth system, as we've also heard this morning. And today I want to disentangle and critique the role of law in creating the Anthropocene's crisis, as well as law's inability, thus far, up until now, at least, to effectively address this crisis or to offer solutions that can meaningfully craft a sustainable and just future, not only for humans, but also for non-humans. And I want to focus specifically on the area of international environmental law. We also look ahead and ask how international environmental law can be reformed to initiate a very long overdue global governance paradigm shift that can confront the deepening Anthropocene crisis. Now, the argument unfolds in several parts. Part one interrogates some of the key features of and failures of international environmental law. And the discussion specifically focuses on three themes. First, the inability of international environmental law to embrace an Earth system perspective and to respond to interconnected Earth system governance challenges, a matter that my colleague, Professor Kim, will speak about immediately afterwards as well. Second, the anthropocentrism of international environmental law that renders it unable to care for particularly vulnerable human beings and, perhaps even more importantly, and the focus of our discussion over these 2 days, a very vulnerable non-human world. Certainly also to the extent that this anthropocentrism counterproductively facilitates environmental destructive neoliberal economic development. And this, of course, is also where corporations come in, which we've already heard about this morning, and we will hear a little bit more about during the course of this talk. And certainly also international environmental law's lack of ambition at a time when precisely such ambition is urgently required. Now, the limitations of international environmental law. I think it's fair to say that international environmental law has made many important contributions to environmental protection in the Holocene epoch. Yet, despite many of these positive developments, it needs to be recognized that there are very clear constraints on what international environmental law can do and can be expected to do as it develops further. If international environmental law is to do more, it must move beyond the constraints of its current architecture and its framing, and it must embrace a fundamental reconceptualization of existing models of governance, whether economic, political, social, or legal. And the new context of the Anthropocene reveals the limits, I think, of international environmental law. Among others, the existing set of international environmental law rules have all been created based on our collective human experience and understanding of a relatively stable and predictable Holocene epoch, the epoch just before the Anthropocene. So international environmental law has therefore not evolved in step with the continuously changing conditions that characterize the Anthropocene crisis. In other words, while the context in which international environmental law was conceived and operates has changed, international environmental law itself has not changed in tandem with that context. We sort of remain on a mission to save the planet, one small little piece of environmental law or treaty at a time. But this is not enough, because the challenges that international environmental law now needs to tackle have become both incredibly complex and enormously challenging. So in what follows, I reflect on three limitations that are preventing, I think, a meaningful progression to a form of international environmental law that can govern powerful human beings in the Anthropocene. And first, we will look at how international environmental law protects a Holocene environment. I think it's fair to say that international environmental law tends to follow a reductionist approach in its efforts to protect a Holocene environment. which means that it leads to a linear, one-dimensional, and segmented, fragmented understanding of what was always incorrectly thought to be discrete, unrelated, sort of localized problems that occur in very specific and disconnected geographical locations. For example, vehicle emissions in Bangladesh is an air problem, it's an air pollution problem in that city, and it has no cascading effects on air quality and global warming elsewhere on the planet, which we now, of course, know is not the case. It does have an impact globally. So in the Anthropocene, a new understanding of the Earth system and its complex, interrelated processes, aspects, and constituents requires urgent changes to governance approaches. And it is only very recently, I think, that the insights from Earth system science have found some purchase in some social science domains like law and governance, with some scholars converging around the idea of Earth system governance and its research agenda, something that my colleague Professor Kim will speak about in a little while. But while some sustainability scholars are starting to grasp the importance of Earth system thinking, the same, I think, cannot be said for environmental lawyers. We still don't think in terms of systems. So practically speaking, the lack of appreciation for systems complexity in international environmental law can, of course, lead to the prioritization of one environmental problem over another. And it reinforces the creation of siloed regulatory regimes, which may lead to problem shifting between separate planetary boundaries. And now we know in a recent study published by the Potsdam Institute of Climate Research that 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries have already been crossed. So if we do not integrate or better coordinate international environmental law institutions in line with how planetary boundaries are interacting in this integrated Earth system, we run the risk of protecting one boundary at the cost of another. And it is therefore necessary that international environmental law reorientates itself alongside an Earth system perspective. Another concern is international environmental law's anthropocentrism, something that has also already been mentioned over the course of this day. Because its anthropocentrism means that it is not able to adequately address environmentally destructive and exploitative neoliberal economic development in ways that also address massive global injustices between the global north, the global south, between species, and between present and future generations. And this is problematic, I think, considering that international environmental law is actually intended to protect the non-human world, is it not? And some even believe that international environmental law has been complicit in creating the Anthropocene's crisis. Because our laws reflect and affirm this anthropocentric environmental ethic, they have become part of the problem. International environmental law, and certainly to the extent that it embraces neoliberal exploitative economic concepts such as sustainable development, merely perpetuates this crisis and is reduced to a means of suppressing the symptoms. We are not tackling the problem at a systemic level. Now, the foundations of international environmental law's anthropocentric ethic were already laid in the 1800s when the first environmental treaties were designed. And all of these sort of conservation instruments pursued very narrow interests that were focused on a utilitarian anthropocentric state economic benefits. And this trend continued throughout 1972 with the Stockholm Declaration and its very explicit anthropocentric ethic that it embraced. And states continued down this human-centered, exploitative neoliberal path, or the so-called environment versus development path, also in 1992 and 10 years later with the World Summit on Sustainable Development. And with the blanket endorsement of this haloed, somehow sacred idea of sustainable development, which in fact is not sustainable, all of these conferences, and even now the Sustainable Development Goals, have further promoted international environmental law's new liberal, development-biased anthropocentrism. So a central point of critique is, I think, that sustainable development is an eco-political project which might neither be sustainable nor developmental. It is a palatable approach to green wrap the economic and political project of sustainable degradation that is already now fully in play. And more concrete evidence, certainly, of the failures of sustainable development as the world's current central development vision is presented by a recent study that evaluated the political impact of the SDGs. And one major finding of the study was that the SDGs have not been able to promote planetary integrity in any meaningful sense. There's also concerns about normative ambition, and nothing to me captures that most or better than Boris Johnson's sort of evil look when he engages with President Modi during the UN climate change conference in 2021. I think with very few exceptions, the substantive norms of international environmental law are not sufficiently ambitious to limit human behavior in a way that could safeguard planetary integrity. International environmental law inevitably seems to chase the lowest common denominator that is shaped by political and economic interests, and it remains unable to achieve the deep structural reforms because it is constrained in its efforts to develop this necessary ambition. And this is obviously as much a matter of political will as it is a matter related to legal reform. International environmental law will only be reformed, and its ambition can consequently only increase if there is the political will to do so. But as long as deeply vested political and economic, including corporate, interests prevail, it is unlikely that international environmental law will increase its ambition. And we clearly see the lack of its ambition during every year's climate conference of the parties during the climate negotiations. And we will now see it again in Dubai in a couple of weeks. States are unable, despite the science being there, despite the IPCC reports clearly telling us what the state of the climate is, states remain incapable or unwilling to increase the ambition of law and governance to respond to what the science tells us is actually happening. And that, to me, is extremely disturbing. That being said, and the most negative part of the talk is over, I'm happy to say, looking ahead and perhaps trying to find a solution for all of this, I want to explore three interrelated proposals, which I think might be able to reform international environmental law. And many of these proposals hang together with what is being discussed at this conference and to its central theme. The first one is Earth system law. I think for international environmental law to better respond to integrated Earth system governance challenges, it must embrace an Earth system perspective. And scholars have been, or are increasingly exploring alternative Earth system-oriented visions of international environmental law. And there are terms, for example, from Klaus Bosselmann, who many of you in the room would know. He calls it Earth-centered law. There's planetary boundaries law, or the law of the Anthropocene. But something that Professor Kim and I came up in 2019, some years ago, although it seems like yesterday, was the concept of Earth system law. And that there is the paper that introduced it, and we're very happy to say that it seems that the concept has been taken up in the scholarship, and several other publications have been coming out related to this, and we are very grateful and humbled that it is being picked up, although not everyone necessarily agrees with it, which is a good thing. In essence, I think the project of Earth System Law offers an alternative framing for international environmental law to facilitate the type of transformations of law and governance that we need to see in the Anthropocene. So Earth System Law is not a new body of law somehow, such as human rights law or trade law or corporate law. It is rather a way of thinking about the law. It is a framework, a challenging one, that forces us to reintegrate of our basic assumptions of what the law is and what it should do. So this new vision for law, Earth Systems Law, is Earth-centered and acknowledges, therefore, that everything is bound together in a social ecological system that are dominated by humans, but that shouldn't be. So it advances a novel systems approach to law, an approach that merges the systemic and the complex nature of the Earth system and of the legal system into a single operative framework. So in doing so, this framework allows the epistemic traveler, people like us in this room, to explore responses to Earth system regulatory implications of the Anthropocene, such as complexity, inclusivity, interdependencies, and, of course, the need for very radical transformations. And this new legal paradigm also encourages lawyers to grapple much more deliberately, and I think this is important, with the natural science aspects of the Earth system, and to translate these into the social science domain in a way that also meaningfully embraces Earth system governmentality. In other words, how to look at Earth system science and how to translate the relevance of that science for law and for governance. That is one of the main projects also of Earth System Law. Because this is important, as it, when one relies on Earth system science, it creates an opportunity for lawyers to understand the nature and the extent of the problem that we need to address by means of the law, which enables us to fashion any legal reforms alongside what the science suggests will be necessary to solve the problem. I think one other advantage of Earth System Law is that it opens up conversations about the law and about law reform to a much larger audience. While international environmental law, as many of the lawyers in the room would know, has been traditionally, at least, a very much monodisciplinary endeavor practiced by hardcore international lawyers, Earth System Law urges those who research, design, interpret, and apply legal norms to actively engage in inter- and transdisciplinary conversations, in learning and processes of knowledge creation to better respond and understand Earth system transformations. Secondly, I think it would be necessary to think about how to ecologize international environmental law. Certainly also a topic that we've been talking about today. We know now that the Anthropocene crisis is also a crisis of ethics. This has been repeated in many of the talks throughout the morning. We would need to adopt a new planetary ethic. And international environmental law will have to, alongside all of our other cultures and religions and social institutions, embrace and give voice to this new ethic. And the process of developing and adopting a new planetary ethic is preconditioned upon the need to being open to alternative ways of seeing, of being, and of knowing that produce epistemologies of care and humility instead of these anthropocentric epistemologies of dominance and mastery, such as those associated with international environmental law's anthropocentric principles of sustainable development. And I think it's necessary to recognize that these epistemologies of care and humility are predicated upon a relational sense of solidarity that recognizes that the subjugation and the suffering of one is in fact indicative of the oppression of everyone. And one already observes the emergence of these alternative, ecological, sustainable ways of seeing, knowing, being, and caring. For one example is buen vivir that we see in the Latin American context. That also forms the basis of the rights of nature movement there. As a central idea in Andean cosmovisions, buen vivir promotes an alternative to the vision of sustainable development. Buen vivir is a biocentric counterweight to anthropocentrism, in which Pachamama, or Mother Earth, is understood as an ever-present deity who is the source and the sustainer of all life, of which humans are only a very, very small part. And I think what is encouraging is the extent to which paradigms such as buen vivir already exercises a growing influence on Latin American jurisprudence, as we see in the growing amount of rights of nature case law. Now, it's very difficult to find such an ecocentric orientation of law in international law, and certainly in international environmental law. The closest example that I came across is the United Nations World Charter for Nature, which has been, surprisingly, endorsed by the United Nations General Assembly. But it seemed to have sort of fallen off the radar of states concerned, possibly because it is so ecocentrically orientated. And my hope would be is that we again revisit some of the examples that we have, that we don't reinvent the wheel, and that we try to draw on the provisions that some of these instruments that states at least some time ago seem to have agreed on as a pathway forward to ecologize international environmental law. Finally, international environmental law will have to raise its level of ambition. That is clear. And apart from drawing on science, which I think would be key to guide the increase of ambition of law, international environmental law must clarify what its ultimate overarching goal is. The future shape and content of law will depend on this goal. The more ambitious the goal is, the more ambitious the provisions of international environmental law will have to be. And several goals have been suggested. Currently, the goal is sustainable development, and for the reasons that I've argued, I think it's not appropriate or sufficient anymore. Other proposals is something such as planetary integrity, for example, or ecological sustainability, which could be a far more radical, ecocentric approach and overarching goal for international environmental law. I want to conclude with a sort of an upsetting quote from the father of the Anthropocene, the notion of the Anthropocene, the late Paul Crutzen, who passed away fairly recently. And he sort of in 2002 seemingly prophetically proclaimed, unless there is a global catastrophe, a meteorite impact, a world war or a pandemic, mankind will remain a major environmental force for many, many millennia. And we will need to foster and champion appropriate behavior, human behavior at all scales, and need to keep that in check. So just as we are emerging certainly from one of the worst pandemics that he prophesied about in decades, the COVID pandemic, we are entering a sort of a new era, seemingly, of intense geopolitical conflicts, where the possibility of the Third World War happening is now more real, I think, than it has been for a long time. And the Anthropocene's crisis might just very well be solved by entirely erasing all humans from the face of Earth, or at least substantially diminishing our geological powers. But I do think that a much more constructive approach to ensuring planetary integrity would be to take up this daunting task to try and ensure appropriate human behavior at all scales. International environmental law can never be a complete solution for fully addressing on its own the complex task of governing the Earth system. But it will always remain a critically important tool in our toolbox because it remains one of the most effective tools of social organization that we have at our disposal. I think that international environmental law, as a technology of social organization, has a lot of catching up to do and will have to reorientate itself much more deliberately to the new context and the deepening governance challenges of the Anthropocene's converging crisis, if it wants to be successful in doing anything meaningful about this crisis. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Kuse. He talked about the international environmental laws and what is the limitations of the IEL and how we can get over those challenges and the limitations of the IEL. Thank you very much for the wonderful talk. For the questions, and we're gonna have the discussion session, and during the discussion, we can get some questions. Thank you very much. Please give him big hands once again. Thank you very much.
Now I'd like to welcome the second presenter, Professor Kim Nak-hyun. I was able to learn from Professor Kim because he's quite famous, and I expected a middle-aged man, but I was really surprised to see a young man. Professor Kim actually have involved in the research in this sector. He studied international environment in Australia, and now he is teaching at the University of Whitlet University, and he is also serving as an associate professor. So as far as I know, Professor Kim is interested in global governance and the international law and how to improve harmoniously with these two subjects. So now I'd like to invite Professor Kim. Please welcome Professor Kim with a big round of applause. Thank you very much, Professor. Actually, I'm older than you think. I look quite young, frankly. I'm 40 years old. I'm so sorry to reveal my age. Maybe I'm not that old, but I'm not a graduate student, so I'm not that young. Thank you very much for inviting me. I don't know if I'm qualified for being part of this conference. This morning, I learned a lot from your discussions. Today, I'd like to share my thoughts with you. So today, my talk will be about Earth system governance. I will briefly introduce about the concept, and I'd like to pose 3 questions regarding this topic. What kind of governance we need? So I'd like to start by asking you a basic question. So we'll delve into the first question. So also we'll reflect what kind of governance we have and how we can transform this system. So first of all, I'd like to talk about the Earth system. For us to talk about Earth system, we have to understand what the Earth system is. According to the Earth scientists, Earth is an object for research. So through modeling that we have come to great understanding of Earth. So if we look at the history of Earth system science, I'm not quite sure where we can go back. However, one popular theory is going back to Gaia theory. In 1970s, James Lovelock and his colleagues came up with the Gaia theory. So I'm sure that you're familiar with the Gaia. So this is if the Earth is only existed with only one flower and on soil, then how the flower is going to survive. So if there is a white flower flourishing, then there will be more temperature going up. However, if black flowers bloom, then the temperature will go down. So if so, then the white flowers will bloom more. So that's a popular daisy model. So through this concept that we know that Earth is an organic being. So many earth scientists refer to Daisy model and Gaia theory. And in this picture, there are no humans. So actually in the Gaia 2.0, humans are included. In the first version of Gaia 1.0, humans were not put into consideration. However, in the version of Gaia 2.0, that it shows how humans have destructed the earth. But also one thing to highlight here is that the humans also have the solution to the self-destruction. Humans have the tool and also the ability to reflect on the destruction, and we can reflect such self-remorse into the decision making. So this is in the Gaia 2.0 that we know that the humans can reflect on our wrongdoings, and also we have the reflexivity, which can reflect on our next decision makings. So the fact of having such ability helps us to change the trajectory of the current trajectory. So the Earth system was in Holocene, but because of the human activities that the Earth is going beyond the Holocene base. But if Earth goes beyond the Holocene basin, then it will enter into a dangerous zone. So we have to move Earth to safe and just planet basin. For us to change the trajectory, humans and nature have to restore the relationship. So humans need to rethink how we can reconnect to the nature. We have to achieve a symbiotic environment. Depending on the choice that the human race chooses, we can continue to continue the Cenozoic, or we can we can stand at the edge, or we can be the last generation of Cenozoic, or we can create Ecozoic. There are approaches that we can make to change the trajectories, but this kind of approach has been contemplated for a long time. In the 1990s and 2000s, the Earth system engineers and scientists had said. Also, Professor Kote mentioned that if you pay attention to the last quote that he used, that engineers and the scientists have to play a big role, and that we should be able to manage the planet. That's one of the emphasis that we need to remember. We have to manage, we have to engineer the planet. So, for example, we can look through this paint. So the geoengineers have to work as doctors, and we have to understand the geo system and open up and diagnose and intervene in the process of fixing the problems. So geoengineering has been touted a lot in this process recently. Since we don't have enough time, I can't go into every situation, but in the stratosphere, we can put mirrors in the air so we can reflect sun to the universe so that we can cool down the universe. So that is one of the approaches in engineering perspective. But this kind of solutions or the approaches have many issues. I personally believe the reason is because there are two reasons. First one is that I think that we are overestimate the human beings, our ability, because you see this earth is a complex being, but we tend to think that the human beings can fix problems and because we overestimate our abilities. And I think also that we tend to we tend to see our complex society in a simple manner. There are different interests, different needs, but we have failed to reflect various needs and interests of different societies. So there are scholars who criticize Earth system management is more like having a commander in the spaceship, and the commander has the authority to direct the Earth to go to a certain trajectory. So we need to have some critical perspective. So these are the opinions of some scholars as well. The reason I explain this kind of concept is to bring up this issue of Earth system governance. We don't say Earth system management, we say Earth system governance. It's because that we are living in a society with multiple stakeholders which need diverse and decentralized governance. We need to ask these questions: what kind of future we want, and how do we accommodate various opinions, because we don't have sole society, we have diverse societies, and whose ideas should be reflected in the final decision, whose knowledge, whose scientific knowledge should be reflected in the final decision making, and who will be sitting at the decision making table. I mentioned earlier about the complexity, who should be responsible for the final decisions. So Earth system governance is disciplinary that scholars have to work on these key questions that I asked. I briefly introduced about the Earth system governance, so now I'd like to go to the key questions that I'd like to ask. What governance should look like? I don't think there is a panacea, but I'd like to come up with one example. Elinor Ostrom argued that there is no panacea, so all the governances and all the initiatives should be experimented. So polycentric governance should be an option in the structure-wise. There should be diverse decision-making centers, and their opinions should be mutually adjusted and create synergy. And diversity should be respected. And by going through numerous experiments, successful models should be introduced and scaled up. So all these activities and initiatives should go toward one collective direction, and then that is a framework of polycentric governance. Then there are human races in the world. Then what kind of a polycentric governance that we need? There are different opinions, of course, but from the perspective of Earth system governance, we should operate in the planetary boundaries. Earth system boundary is a new concept. It can be considered as an environment boundaries. I mean, after the environment boundary, the concept was introduced, then some scholars argue that there should be a societal concept. So these two of the concepts are combined as Earth system boundaries. So for us to remain in the green corridor, then what kind of Earth system should be reflected? Of course, we need to systemize the governance. We have sustainable development goals, and that's one good example. I don't think the sustainable development goals have been effective. But anyway, that we need a coordination to create synergy. And we need to downsize the related concept so that this concept should be downsized to each nation so that the individually and also the corporations and the national governments should know their responsibility. That is also one part of justice, and democratization is one way, because what I'm trying to say is that decision making should be democratized. If you look into the Earth system boundaries and also the planetary boundaries as well, but if you open it, then you will see that the only 20 or 30 minutes researchers come up with these ideas. Then we have to doubt if these limited number of people can represent the whole human beings. So science should be democratized, and in this process, that the human voices should be democratized. Then what about the voices of non-human species? So in that context, democratization should be considered. And these four concepts are the focus of functions in operating the Earth system governance. Then where are we standing? If the direction is the one that I just explained, then where are we standing? It's been 15, 20 years since this Earth system or the governance concept is introduced. About 600 to 1,000 researchers are working on this subject, and this is a research framework of Earth systems research framework through 5 research lenses. They are using these lenses to understand the Earth system governance. Of course, I cannot cover all these research lenses, so my research is mainly focusing on architecture. The building block for the architecture is international institutions. International institutions serve as key building blocks of global governance. So these international institutions serve as basic blocks. There are many of them. In the environment governance, more than 1,000 environment-related treaties are created. I asked three main questions: whether these international institutions are effective, are they individually effective, and these institutions interact. But when they do that, do they create synergy? I study on this kind of interplay. And if we look at this whole thing as a whole, is the whole greater than the sum of the parts? So if I give you some answers that the individual institutions are not effective, one of the reasons to do so is almost all international institutions are made in the assumption of Holocene, and then they are not relevant in Anthropocene, so they are outdated. So if we look at the interplay, so through interplay, that synergy is created, but in many, many cases, there are trade-offs and also conflict, and then they are shifting problems to each other. And if we look at the whole system as a whole, you can see how fragmented the system is. You can see how synergistic the operation process is. So it's a good indicator to see how fragmented they are. So if I give you only the results, then of course we cannot avoid conflicts. However, it is way more than we ideally think. Then what's the answer? How can we solve these problems? As a solution to such conflicts, the UN proposed SDGs, and UN adopted SDGs, and then SDG has contributed to uniting the international organizations. Until 2015-2016, the fragmentation decreased. However, after SDGs, the fragmentation have worsened. The reason behind is that behind the 17 SDGs, the fragmentation have worsened surrounding 17 issues, so silos are strengthening. Then why is that? If I may briefly explain why. I think SDGs inherently have fragmentations. It's because it reflects the existing international system. And the 17 goals have 169 targets. So countries and the companies can do cherry picking. And powerful actors water down, and they watch the effect of SDGs. So as a result, SDGs have very limited political effect. And also, Ricote mentioned that the ineffectiveness of SDGs. Then how can we transform the governance? That I'd like to briefly explain about the international Earth system law. As Professor Kote explained earlier, Earth system law doesn't necessarily mean to environmental law. But my research have been focusing on international environmental law. There are two dimensions unpacked to use to unpack environmental law into perspectives. So first, a dimension was international law, global transnational law, and planetary law. And the other dimension is dividing the law into environmental law, ecological law, and earth law. So how can we go from the left upper side to the mature version to planetary Earth law, which is the right bottom? I contemplated the ways that we can go from environmental law plus international law to the planetary Earth law. I believe various efforts should be put in place. For example, for us to achieve international environment law, we should embrace non-state actors. So the international norms from the non-traditional sources should be reflected in the international lawmaking. Then we can go toward global environmental law. And these norms should reflect ecological values, then we can achieve global ecological law. For example, a good example is Earth Charter. It was introduced as an alternative to 1992 Rio Charter. And by embracing ecological efforts, if countries embrace, then we can achieve international ecological law. And then that's the example that Professor Kotze used. And a good example is World Charter for Nature. And if we move on further to the radical side, if we embrace more radical norms like UNGA Harmony with Nature or UN Declaration of Rights of Mother Earth, then we can create the international Earth law. And in this regime, the states will serve as trustee of Earth. But if we move further, not only states, but humanity, if humanity can assume the role of trustees, then we can go to global Earth law. But if we achieve more sustainable condition of Earth, then one example is Paris Agreement. We have to achieve 1.5 degrees. That's a specific target. However, that it includes only one planetary boundary. However, that's not enough, that we need to respect diverse planetary boundaries. And if we do so, then planetary Earth law can be created. Planetary boundary is also human-centric because the boundary is suggested for to provide safe space for human. But do we need to ask if this environment is also this space is safe for non-humans? So if we consider that as well, then we can achieve global Earth law. And the most mature system is planetary Earth law, in my thinking. In this system, that human and non-human can live as cohabitants. And then when we assume these roles together with non-human beings, we can share universal norms. So jurisdictions will be meaningless. And Professor Kotze suggested the concept, planetary commons. Indian monsoon or Amazon are critical elements. So these critical elements should be protected by law. So there should be given the status of commons. So Professor Kote suggested this concept, plenary commons. So based on these efforts that we can advance our international law system. If we can achieve mature version of Earth planetary law, I'm not saying that the international environmental law is not necessary. Eventually, we have to go toward a mature version. However, in this process, we have to also consider polycentric governance because we need to consider various stakeholders. Although we have this final goal, I'm not saying that this is the only goal, but all in these arrows, there are areas that we need to put efforts together. So in sum, the Earth system governance is Earth-centered governance paradigm, and all the living beings become the subject of governance. Therefore, variety, diversity should be respected because it's a polycentric governance. I'm not suggesting a certain model. In the highlight that the important element is the systems and planetary. We need to have systems and planetary perspectives, and also interdisciplinary study is very important. And especially the legal scholars should be included for us to achieve Earth system law. So in this community, law scholars and also the role of lawyers have to contemplate it. So the time's up. Yeah, this is the end of my presentation. Thank you. Professor Kim talked about how can we achieve Earth's system governance in the era of Anthropocene. He shared with challenges that we have and the direction we have to go. So we're going to have now discussion. So discussants and the panelists, please come forward to the stage.
들리시나요? 네.
So without break, let's get into the discussion. Before we forget the contents of the presentation without any break, let's get into the discussion right away. And thank you very much for the two presenters. We have three panelists who are going to do some discussion from the Kangwon University, from the law school, Professor Park Dae-yeon, who is a master of the Earth Jurisprudence, and renowned biocracy expert. Sorry. Professor An Byung-jin. Sorry. Professor An Byung-jin. And we talked about the roles of the scientist, and we need to have more scientific approach. And we have a Dr. Kwon Won-tae, who is a scientist. So we have three wonderful discussants, and I would like to give them some time so that they can start their discussion regarding the presentation made by Dr. Kuze and Dr. Kim. And let's start the discussion. And you have 5 to 10 minutes each. And after listening to their discussion, and we'd like to open up the floor so that we can get more questions and continue our discussion. Who would like to go first? Then Dr. Kwon, as a scientist, and you can start the discussion. And listening to your presentation, well, it gives me a headache because the concept is something new to me. But while I was listening to you, while I was reading through the proceedings, I came up with some of the ideas that I'd like to share them with you. My major is the climate dynamics, the science. And I've been following the IPCC report, and I've been engaged in IPCC reporting. And I was one of them. A planetary boundary and Earth system boundary was discussed today. And let me share what I think about those two new concepts. As a person who majored climate science, I was wondering how we can accept the planetary boundary and Earth system boundary and how those concepts came into being. What is most important is this. In any academic society, we focused on the local area, or I would say the knowledge was fragmented rather than integrated. However, to tackle the climate issue, in the 1970s, we only studied flow of the air, only. Only with the flow of the air, we created a general circulation model. That was fragmented. So we were not able to handle the issue because air is only one of the climate. Then people started to study about the key factors. Another key factor was ocean. So people started to study about air and ocean. There was a kind of expansion. And then people started to understand, oh, ocean is not the answer. So people added another factor, climate model. And many of the factors, many of the indicators were included. But what is really important is the knowledge we know. Even though we combine them, we should be able to integrate them and express them clearly. However, sometimes we were missing with the information. For example, the information was not adequate about the air. The information was not adequate about the ocean. The information was not adequate from the ecosystem and from the land, whatever that may be. As we have more and more information, we came up with better science because we got lots of information from many of the sectors. Now people started to talk about Earth system model. It is looking into feedback and interaction among various objects and various factors. I don't think this one is relevant only to climate science. Probably, whenever you want to understand climate and environment, you should have this kind of holistic or comprehensive approach rather than looking into only a few factors. And I personally believe that is how the planetary concept came into being. In 2009, planetary boundary was emerging and Earth system was coined in 2012, I guess. In the planetary boundary concept, actually, initially, it was covering some of the fragmented factors, for example, climate and also acidification of the ocean. So some of the environmental and climate issues were measured in the early stage. That was the beginning of the planetary boundary. Regarding the Earth system boundary, and when I was reviewing the literatures, I know Dr. Kim is expert in doing this. The planetary boundary concept is totally different from the planetary boundary concept of 10 years ago or the 12 years ago. In the past, people tried to use a single concept to explain planetary boundary. However, it is not the case anymore. When the animal is extinct, and then people try to understand that from the ecosystem viewpoint, and for the deforestation and land utilization. In the past, they were two different indexes. However, now people try to view them as a part of the ecosystem. So people come with the word functional integrity, which means each item, each object within the ecosystem should be seamlessly integrated as a part of the ecosystem. So I can say we are making positive progress in developing the knowledge or the concept about planetary boundary. You talked about SDG, but in SDG, as a climate scientist, I studied SDG from my perspective out of 17 SDGs. Yes, there is a climate development goals, but almost all the goals were interrelated to climate change. I would say 10 goals, 10 development goals are related to climate change, like water. For example, gender equality is somehow related to climate. So again, these issues cannot be addressed by the science only. We should have the social and humanitarian approach as well, not just purely based on the science. So Earth system governance is critically important because we need multi-sectoral approach. Thank you very much for the wonderful contribution of the speakers. And you made me awakened and enlightened because my perspective has been broadened thanks to you. While listening to what you say, well, what is the next step? You talked about the governance and the legal system. Then how should we put that into layperson word so that everybody can understand and everybody can act on it? The same goes to climate change. Climate change is critical. This is an urgent issue. And climate change will have significant consequences. And our safety and justice are threatened because of the climate change. I would say human being is selfish. Human being focus only on present me rather than future generation. This one is risky and this can become riskier, but people don't take action. People do not reduce emission. What does that mean? Earth system governance is an important goal and a noble goal. However, all the actors should be able to understand the concept and act on it. We should come up with some practical advice and practical measures. We are talking about it in the expert group, but bringing this concept to the general public is something different. So that can be the next step that we should take. Only then the Earth system governance can be passed down to, or rather expanded to the general public. But what matters is the clock is ticking. We don't have 10, 20 years? Well, we should take action immediately. We should do something meaningful within 10 years. Time is ticking. So I feel so disturbed about it. Climate change is happening right now. So we should be within the safe zone. In the future, after 10 to 20 years, we will be outside of the safe zone. That means what we discussed today should be put into action because that is really meaningful. And that is something that we should pursue in the future. I hope everybody can be on the same page, everybody can understand this and act on it. Thank you.
권은태 박사님께서 실제 이런
So we were able to learn how this Earth system governance has developed. The Earth system started to explain one phenomenon, and now we have developed into a stage where we can contemplate various things. And since we don't have time, that we have to be effectively able to explain that to the general audiences. And now I'd like to give the microphone to Mr. Kwon Won-tae. Oh, sorry, Ms. Kwon just shared her opinion, and now I'd like to welcome Professor An. Okay, I'd like to make a brief share with my brief opinion. So I was actually frustrated to be part of this discussion. When I went to the U.S., I was really excited, but in the first class that I was frustrated by the legal terms. But while listening to the two presentations, I was surprised to hear the perspective from the politics. So I learned a lot. Professor Park is in the different the committee, and Professor Park and I can work together in the same commission. We are not much different because from these two presentations, I was really surprised to learn that there is not much different from the research questions. I mean, Professor Kim posed 8 questions, but in also politics, I mean, these 8 questions are critical questions. So we are not talking different things. We are on the same pages. So Dr. Kim posed critical questions that we have to solve in politics. Worldwide, we are facing critical difficulties. As 2 professors mentioned, that we have come to a close point, to the tipping points. It's not only climate, but that we are approaching singularity point in terms of AI. Mogabet, the head of Google X, says that we are approaching fast to the singularity. However, all the systems that we have are too old. Hannah Arendt, one famous scholar, said that if science doesn't pose light to the future, that the spirit of humans will be lost in the past. So he mentioned this several times in his well-known book, and I think we are lost in the dark. Hannah Arendt, I think he lived in a happy life. He escaped the Nazi, but he escaped to the U.S. But he saw the freedom, he saw the light, and he saw the better hope. But the U.S. freedom system had great problems, and then this current generation is going through the difficulties. From 1960s, all the presidents knew about the climate change. They knew that the problem was coming, but they failed to solve the problems. But the two professors proposed critical questions about the Earth's system. However, unfortunately, our current system is not reflecting the new changes. The Israel-Hamas war could have been fixed in 2000s. Actually, there were two good opportunities. Bill Clinton and the then Prime Minister in Israel, that they had a good negotiation. However, they failed to come to the final resolution. The reason is because of the internal politics had different voices in the U.S. and also in Israel. So the voices of the elected people in the democracy had different voices. Then we need to think about democracy. Of course, it has contributed to developing our human society. However, that they are representing the whole people, and these elected people continue to reflect the voices of the general population. So not only in the Hamas war and Israel war against Hamas, and also the AI and also climate changes, that we are entangled in this situation, in these difficulties. So we are desperate. By listening to the two professors, of course, I absolutely agree with the necessity of global governance. However, before doing that, we need to also contemplate how we have to think about how we can fix our democracy. Minister Kang suggested the book by Thomas Berry, so we were able to learn the teaching by Thomas Berry, and he once mentioned that maybe we shouldn't use the term democracy anymore. So your two professors' presentation created great resonance. But at the same time, we should create a society where we inherit the great fruits of democracy, but we shouldn't stick to the principle of democracy. Professor Kim said that we have to do a lot of experiments, like polycentric experiments. So we have to do diverse experiments. We need to abolish democracy, but still we need to inherit the fruits of democracy in our decision making. Nobody has elaborated this solution, but we have to think how we can make this process successful. So I'd like to ask these two professors, you mentioned about the Earth system governance, but in one country, who should we exclude or who should include in our decision making? Can you please elaborate that? And then what kind of relationship that kind of decision making has to democracy? Is it enough to include more people? Who should we include and who should exclude? And then do we need to include more people? And then what do you think about democracy in this relationship? Do we need to fix the current system? Do we need to revolutionize the UN, because the UN, the system is not working. They are not working to stop the Israel-Hamas war. So do we need to create a new thing, or do we need to fix the existing system?
교수님께서 매우
Thank you. That is a really serious proposal. We are facing the crisis of the governance. There is a gap about the governance. How best we can address that was the question raised by Professor An. Last but not least, I would like to invite Professor Park, and from the Earth Jurisprudence perspective. So what do you think about this? First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. My discussion will be based on a single question, but let me give you a kind of prelude. And based on my understanding on the Earth jurisprudence, I would like to spend some time. The Earth system law. And I read the article just about 3 years ago. And I came up with this kind of new concept when I did not know even about the Earth jurisprudence. So it was too difficult for me. But anyway, thanks to this opportunity, I was able to listen to the author of the articles that I encountered 3 years ago. So I was able to understand what is the difference between the Earth system law and Earth jurisprudence. What can be the difference and what can be the similarity between the two. We published a book about Earth jurisprudence, and the publisher said we should change the title, A Law for the Earth, because he thought that the concept was too difficult to understand. But if we change the title as the Law for the Earth, it means there should be a legal system to protect the integrity of the Earth. But as I was studying the Earth jurisprudence, I can say the core idea is what is the foundation of the law. The core of the law, according to Earth jurisprudence, is the Earth. That is the core. The Earth is the very source and the very core that is generating a kind of the norm, or the Earth is the lawgiver, the first lawgiver. The kind of core or the source of the law has been studied a lot, and there are two ideologies regarding what is the core or the source of the law. The first one is based on the nature. The second one is based on the utilitarian approach. And I would say the Earth jurisprudence is standing on the history of the law of nature. According to an ancient philosophy of China, people follow the earth. And we have a kind of the morality that comes out of the nature. And it has been translated into a model. That can be translated into model. Earth jurisprudence means to study the mechanism how the earth is working, and the human being should follow the model of the mechanism how the earth is working. So in that sense, we can say the earth model is a kind of norm, because human beings should follow the earth model that can be regarded as a great law, and human law should follow the great law. Self-making is really important in the great law. And the third one is relations, and the first one is the differentiation. Based on natural science, the great law can be created, and the great law is something beyond the human law, and human should follow the great law. And one means what is really important is we should follow the natural law and we should generate the self-regulation according to the regulation of the nature. It is more like a self-regulation based on the nature. This is the model that human should follow. That is why the earth or the cosmos is the first lawgiver. Then, Earth system law is based on the science of Earth system, and normative indication should be derived out of the Earth science. Probably that is why the word Earth system law was created. Dr. Kim came up with 8 research questions. For example, whose ideas and whose knowledge should be put onto the table, and who are the right stakeholders, and how the goal-setting process should be made, and how we should change the society, and how we can reduce the uncertainty, and who should take the responsibility. There were 8 topics that have been discussed. As Professor An said, that is a classical topic within the political science. That is one of the core topics within the political science. When we approach these goals from the Earth system law, the regulatory implication should be generated. And I'm not sure whether my understanding is correct. But let me put it this way. I saw the 2x2 matrix, international, global, planetary, and the ecology, Earth, environment. And I can see the x-axis and y-axis. I believe that can be a great framework that Dr. Kim provided. What is more interesting for me is how the international becomes global and how the global goes to the next step. That kind of pathway was really interesting for me. And regarding the Earth system, what kind of path can be the right path to build the Earth system? Not just the normative implication and technical implication should be studied. Yes, that is a concept beyond the Earth Jurisprudence. My question is, Earth system law, in my understanding, is correct or not? That's my question. If my understanding is correct, Earth system law is covering this kind of classical ideas, and how much progress was made, and what is the future task for Earth system law. The presenter talked about the pathway and how best we can find out what can be the good pathway. That kind of tools or mechanism can be really important. The legal personal food is a kind of pathway within the concept of Earth jurisprudence. For example, human and non-humans should be sitting on the table as a stakeholder. The non-humans will have the legal personal food, and they can be a stakeholder within the concept of Earth jurisprudence. Then we can step into the planetary discussion. The pathway or the tool is really important. My question is, the Earth system law has any kind of tools or the pathway that it can suggest? Thank you very much.
제가 발제
We have listened to the very difficult questions, and the two professor must be find it very difficult to answer the questions. So, first question was, how can we help the general audiences to be better acquainted with the Earth system governance, the concept? And the second question was that in the presentations that we dealt with international system, in the international scene that we are failing with many systems. How can we apply this Earth system governance in a national level? While having dinner yesterday, the professor An and I had discussions about the failing UN. So, and the number 3 is that Professor Park understood Earth jurisprudence. He understood Earth jurisprudence in his understanding, and he'd like to know how the Earth law can be used as a pathway to achieve Earth jurisprudence. So, two professors, that you can choose a question if you like. I mean, all 3 questions were very difficult, but you can choose one if you like.
There? Yes, there. Thank you very much for these very rich questions and for this critical reflection, and also the challenging questions, certainly. I'm sure that there's no right or wrong answer to any one of them, but perhaps just to speak more broadly on some of the points that have been raised while attempting to answer some of the questions that you so clearly pointed out. I think that part of the answer or the solution in moving from the conceptual debate that we are having to a more practical solution would be to exploit this notion of polycentrism that Professor Kim has also noted. And I think there is a lot of potential. What we are seeing today in society, the rise of social movements, social climate movements, for example. The courts are increasingly stepping up as very important actors in environmental governance, certainly in the area of climate litigation. We are seeing an increased role at the urban level, for example, in cities. We are seeing an increased role and the influence of the media, both positive and negative. Of course, social media is often very polarized, which also has its dangers. But I think that the media certainly also can play a very central role in this polycentric governance model. And then certainly scientists and practitioners like us who sit in this room. I think there's both a duty on us and a tremendous opportunity to translate these concepts both into practice and to show to the outside world, as it were, what can be done. And there is a lot of energy, I think, in many of these movements that I've noticed. And to me, certainly, it is very different from what you have all rightly said, the failures of the United Nations system. I'm not very optimistic that we will find a miracle solution at the UN very soon, if at all. I think many of the innovation and possibly the solutions that we see and would need to see going forward would come in a more bottom-up way from actors that we expected the least. So that would be my response to that aspect. And perhaps also one point, in moving from sort of the plan to the practice, I think humans are so inherently, humans only respond to a crisis if we perceive it as a crisis. And we've seen this with the COVID pandemic, for example. We actually managed to respond to the COVID pandemic because at one point we recognized, but this is a crisis. We need to close everything, and we did. Many people suffered, of course, unmentionably so. And restriction of freedoms and so forth. And so we've all been there and we all experienced it. But I think that once we perceive the climate crisis as crisis, we would be able to produce sufficient social regulatory institutions to confront that crisis. And as a last point, perhaps, I think that this movement from international law to transnationalism, to a system-orientated form of law and governance, we already see this. We already see this with the steady progression from what used to be this top-down, centered state governance, where the government tells you and makes the laws and the policies, to this gradual emergence of alternative actors within the governance paradigm, such as the media, such as social movements, and so forth, who are playing an increasingly important role. And this, to my mind, is extremely beneficial to fostering the type of transnational processes that we already see and would need to see much more in future. Thank you. That would be my response for now. Thank you.
님께서 또 질문에 대한
And Professor Kim, can you answer the questions? Thank you very much for the questions. These were difficult questions. I don't know if I can answer to these challenging questions. First of all, I think, the science policy interface related question was the most difficult one, I think. And how can we put this concept and the theory into practice? How can we appeal to the general public? That is the question that I am grappling with every day. I don't have the answer, unfortunately, but that comes to my mind. I used a geoengineering example. I think it will come to our face. I mean, it will come to very immediate in front of us. Although I don't want that, then we will be able to. I mean, we should be able to modify everything, all our daily lives. Then we will need bigger governance. So when the time comes, then if we realize that we need necessary governance, although it will be a very unfortunate occasion, that we will come up with governance. And also, Professor An asked a question about democracy. We need to have sustainable decision makings in the global democratic scene. I'm not a specialist in democracy, but the Global Assembly in the system that we can select like 500 people It's like a jury system. So it's like a jury system that we can randomly select 500 people and then have them represent the general public's voice. I mean, it's experimental. So in the existing system, UN Trustship Council is one option. By reviving the system that we give the responsibility as a nature trustee. I know that there is discussion like that going on. And one state, one vote system is not working. But then consensus basis system, I mean, it's not working too. Then but depending on the responsibility and power responsibility that we can give different weight to different countries. I know that there are different discussions going on like that. And for us to and also we can hear opinions through online, but that also that we can raise questions like do people have all internet access? I think currently the UN SDGs 17 goals are too many. There are trade-offs, and then we need to have better goals. And I mean, there are clearly trade-offs. And Professor Park posed very, very difficult question about the system governance and the law difference. I think if you ask question to Professor Kote and to me, then they will both have different answers. Personally, I think I proposed a framework for the concept that I think we have to fill the blank in the framework, that we provide only broader definition, but we didn't provide the concrete context. I mean, of course, I have my own opinions, but I didn't want to fill all the framework with my opinions because I didn't want to give too much influence with my own thoughts. There must be different opinions. I think the Earth's governance has a holistic view, but the law has different perspective, holism, because in holism things are all connected. But in the system view, we have to identify that which ones are interlinked and how they're different in the dynamics. So we have to create governance measure with these different understandings because there are clearly system differences. And also you mentioned about the nature. I'm grappling with the concept of nature. Do we include nature in the Anthropocene? Then if nature is not included, then where should we go back? If we leave nature as it is, and is that the status quo that we want? Earth system law is non-centric or not non-centric, which means living the nature as it is. There's no dualistic distinction between the two systems. And also, one more thing that I'd like to mention lastly. So socialists and the humanist researchers and also the person who is working on the legal concept, I wanted to explain the concept and the core. Of course, there must be differences in these differences, but we need to find commonalities in these differences, and also we need to find ways that we can complementing different concepts. And in these areas, we have to think how we can successfully collaborate with different concepts. Thank you.
두 분의 어려운 질문
And thank you very much for the answer. We have around 10 minutes. I want to open the floor. If there is any question from the floor, you are free to ask a question to anybody. If you have a question, we can open the floor and get some questions from the floor.
네, 저희 한국환경연구원의 한상훈입니다.
And Han Sang-hoon, who is the Environmental Research Center, Dr. An said we should abandon the word democracy. I do agree with you, in a sense, but it is not going back to dictatorship. And can you answer? When we abandon democracy, should we go back to dictatorship or the authoritarianism? And sometimes there can be legitimate authoritarianism. My question goes to you. And can you elaborate a little bit more? What is the ground or what is the reason behind that you say we should abandon democracy? Because that's why you raised the question.
소위 가버넌스가 많다.
You said that there are too many governances. So these governances are fragmented and not effective. That's what I understood from you. It may sound too contradicting. I'd like to give you a Korean case. In Korea, the regional governments are working hard to implement SDGs, and Jeju Island is one of them. And Dobonggu area, Dobonggu district, has set up a SDG commission. And Gangbuk district has mountains like Dobong and Gangbuk. But despite the committee, they don't necessarily understand SDGs. We need to have grassroots groups to implement SDGs. High number doesn't necessarily mean good implementation of synergy. Since my opinion is a bit contradicting, I'd like to ask your opinion, Professor An. And Mr. Park?
And regarding democracy again, and you talked about the pathway, and participation can be a way of the pathway. And there are many of the attorneys from the law firms, and they are wielding their power from the offenders against the nature. And even though we have an agency that can speak for the nature, probably they cannot speak on behalf of the nature because they cannot communicate clearly. Well, probably we should think about how best we can have the better agency rather than just the traditional agency for the nature and non-humans. There were 3 questions regarding democracy. Dr. An, 1 minute please, because we do not have a lot of time. Just 1 minute. Thank you very much. Let me be brief. What I mean is, we should go beyond democracy. We should be creative about the governance, just like a polycentric governance. It is high time for us to think about the polycentric governance. Harvard University thought about the sustainable future, And when Dr. Faust was the president, he was not elected. He was not elected. And throughout the governance process, he was elected by the board member. It was not based on democracy. He was rather appointed. So in that case, the democratic process is not always good. And there is a UK-based company, they have another set of the governance. Democracy is necessary, but in Korea, we should go beyond democracy. We should be more creative, and we should explore more governance. This can be a little bit dangerous, but authoritarian regimes will be coming in. The fascism or the authoritarian interventions will be made when we have the climate crisis. The eco-fascism is taking place in Australia, EU, and US. Of course, we cannot rely on fascism, so we should have the due process, which will be a little bit authoritarian, but the process should be legitimate enough. Just like two processors said, we should do everything we can do to fix what is broken right now. Of course, we should get prepared for the worst case. We should explore that. Life does not go as you expected.
아마 김낙현 교수님께 드렸던데 사실 저도 약간의 질문이 있었어요. 아까 말씀하신
And then he also asked a question about the polycentric approach. There are many international environment laws and institutions, but they are not that efficient. But, the many institutions mean that the polycentric concept, right? I think there is confusion in it. Can I elaborate on democracy a little bit? When I teach my students that, I ask this question. Do you want democracy? Or do you want dictatorship if we can address sustainability issue? And then many, good number of students say that I'll embrace dictatorship. So I think that discussion that you just posed will be valuable discussion. Actually, I haven't used effective, ineffective. I think the efficacy and the effective, they are different. If we go for effectiveness, I'm not saying that the smaller number of institutions are required for effectiveness, but what I'm trying to say is that there should be a less number for different reason. Yeah, yes, definitely, I agree with you because MDGs are not working well. Then how can we have larger governance? But while working on this subject, that I realized that there are many cherry picking, and then you can easily assume that the economic growth is the most cherry picking topic. GDP is mentioned 9 or 11 times in the SDG frameworks. So many countries are prioritizing economic growth as part of SDGs, and that's why I was concerned about SDGs. But as you mentioned, that all the local communities cannot implement 17 goals there, so there should be the SDGs contextualized depending on the situation.
해주시면.
Last but not least, Dr. Park, let me be short. Thank you for the question. For the rights of the nature, I would say the governance system is changing. In the environmental protection, the state is protecting the nature. However, now the governance is changing. The government, state, and other stakeholders are a part of the governance. We have a more democratic governance. to understand what can be the benefits of the nature and what can be the rights of the nature. And we should align the benefit between the nature and the human. That is something that we should do. And in the middle, our approach to nature, our relations to nature shall become different. Just like in the case of the New Zealand. For example, they have the state and they have the people from the original culture. So they have the two stakeholders at the same time. So that kind of approach can be a different set of the governance. And I believe that can be a really good example because New Zealand is trying to protect the nature and the native New Zealand people. We are almost done. Thank you very much for staying with us till the end of the session. Dr. Kuze said Earth system law is a kind of way of thinking. It is a way of thinking. As Professor Park said, the core or the source of the law is the nature, and we should make that as a norm or the legal system, and then we should come up with some solutions. I sincerely hope this session was helpful in changing our mindset or in the way of thinking. I would like to thank the two presenters and the three discussants. Thank you very much. Please give them big hands.